this is not a good message for mental health to say that people have all these deficits and impairments and stuff. And I don't think that this matters a lot whether your measured IQ happens to fall above or below 70. I do not have an intellectual disability myself, but I know a lot of advocates who do have intellectual disabilities and know of others who I think do have opinions about this sort of thing. And that would tend to suggest that an arbitrary IQ dividing line at 70 is not, defining some people who are invulnerable to this sort of language. Maybe there are people who are invulnerable to this sort of language if you looked hard enough. But another question is, do we even need this idea of deficit? And I'll return to that later. I'm not convinced that it actually helps us. The pathology paradigm is really making all of these claims, about somebody having this objective deficit that are really setting up this assumption where, as a researcher, we are able to make this objective statement about this person. We're in a position where we have that that objectivity, that authority, that separation. And that just really doesn't make sense, because everybody who is neurodivergent in our world is a neurodivergent person in a society where neurotypical people have had most of the power and most of the organization of society has been done by them. Autistic advocates have been saying, okay, let's take all of this language about the objective deficits of the autistic person, but instead use it to describe neurotypicals. Because it is in fact the case that it is not objective. And for example, with something like especially the social features of autism, if somebody is having trouble with social communication and interaction with a neurotypical person, does it really make sense to just say that, well, it's the autistic person's fault? That's an interactional situation. By definition, there are two parties involved. And oftentimes, despite the theory that a lack of social motivation is like the core deficit of autism, it's often autistic people who are motivated to engage socially with neurotypical people who make overtures of friendship and then are rejected or even victimized and scorned, mocked or exploited. To be fair, there are areas where there's concerns about the neurodiversity paradigm, and really probably the main one is this fear that we might no longer be able to ever intervene to support people by changing them somehow. And I think that this is actually a useful thing sometimes. As I was saying before, we probably do it far too much now and don't pay enough attention to environments now, but there are circumstances where we want to change people. But I don't think it is necessary that we assume deficit in order to do this. In fact, neurotypical children, they will learn language pretty much automatically. They will not learn math or spelling automatically. We, in fact, have set up an education system premised on the assumption that we will have to explicitly teach math and spelling. We do not call neurotypical kids deficient because we have had to set up the system. We just set up the system. Does it actually make sense that we have to say that somebody is deficient in order that we proceed to do some sort of intervention that is aiming to somehow change them, to teach them a new skill or something? And do we even have to say whether the individual has a deficit or whether it's the environment that's at fault? First of all, I think this is a very difficult question to answer because it really depends on our imagination. I have to imagine all these counterfactual alternate worlds where maybe such and such a thing is accommodated, and does it make sense to imagine these worlds? Are they feasible? It gets into some really weird territory. Whereas a much more practical question might be, would it make more sense, not in order to normalize the person, but in order for them to thrive, to have good quality of life, that we try and change the individual, teach them new skills or whatever, or that we try to change their environment? And to me, it is not at all the same question as the first one. Like, for example, if we take the example of sensory sensitivity, Erica pointed out some positive sensory features of autism earlier, but the sensory distress that accompanies sensory sensitivity, that specific sensory feature, is pretty negative. It is inherently distressing and bad. It is also caused by something internal in the brain, so I think there's a good case, such as one can make such a case, that this would be a deficit in the individual. But we're not going to be able to intervene to change somebody's brain somehow to remove sensory distress very easily. It's going to be a lot easier to somehow modify the sensory environment around them, either by directly changing the sensory stimuli or putting some kind of technological thing interposed between the individual and their environment. Or to take another example, self-injurious behaviors like headbanging are pretty inherently harmful, and presumably they're caused ultimately by something within the brain of the individual. I think there's a good case to be made there, again, such as one can say such things, that this is a deficit. But if we're going to intervene, again, it's going to be much more effective to try and look at what might be stressing the individual out in their environment and changing that. So I do not think that there is really much of a link here between deficit and teaching skills or interventions that might change people. In fact, I think that the ability to intervene by changing people, by teaching them skills, can be a very useful thing. That if we always accommodated everything and never challenged people, then that would put them into a position of complete dependence, which is not at all what we want. When we're talking about this neurodiversity paradigm, as a self-advocate, that is not at all what I want. What I want people to be is empowered. To be empowered and to have these abilities to succeed for themselves and on their own merits, as much as feasibly possible. And on that note about disempowerment, we really do fail here in terms of supports and services today, because these are supports and services typically that have been set up by a system without the individual's input and offered to the individual after perhaps a long process of advocacy where they have to actually prove they deserve these things. And then it's that dynamic where the individual is then coming as a petitioner, as somebody who is seeking help, as somebody who is saying, you know, I have these deficits, and you, the expert neurotypical, you have this expertise and knowledge that you can use to help me. And it's this sort of charitable idea, this idea that the neurodivergent person is put into a position of complete inferiority, and this is so uncomfortable. Let me tell you, in terms of wanting to ever access services and supports when they're delivered in this way. You don't want to come to somebody as a petitioner in a position of inferiority, asking the neurotypical expert to condescend to help you. You want to be empowered as you access supports. And I really think that we can provide these supports in a way that would get away from this dynamic. It's just that right now that is overwhelmingly not being done. So to summarize everything that I've been saying really quickly, I think that there are some useful ideas in the neurodiversity paradigm. Maybe there's not some complete list of tenets that everybody can agree on, but there are some useful ideas here. And I've mentioned 4 ideas, and some of them have already been mentioned by other people today. And then, of course, there's a lot of other ideas that other people were mentioning today that we might toss in here as well. I also think that we can incorporate these insights into our understanding of the world without saying that we necessarily want to give up the ability to ever change the individual, to teach the individual new skills. On the contrary, we want to retain that because we want people to be empowered and to have abilities to do things for themselves, to be more independent and capable, not completely dependent, within whatever their potential might be, of course. And we would want to, of course, do any such intervention to help people in a way that's empowering, not disempowering. And we aren't going to make progress on these issues without dialogue across these segregated groups. And so I am really, really encouraged by the fact that at this Neurodiversity Summit, we have this super broad audience.